A little bit of background for me. I've been in journalism for about 15 years, and I helped to run at the University of Miami a nonprofit called the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting. We do collaborative reporting that is largely foundation funded in partnership with traditional media in Florida. And at the same time, I've kind of tried to establish an expertise as much as possible in the FBI's counterterrorism program. And that started a few years back while I was a fellow at UC Berkeley, and I spent time researching the program, which ultimately led to the book that Mel mentioned. And the conclusion of it sounds like it should be coming from someone who has a tinfoil hat, right? And the conclusion is that the FBI is responsible for more terrorism plots in the United States than any other organization. And I know that sounds like conspiracy theory on its face, but it's not. And I know that's probably not how you think about the FBI, or you even think about the FBI as being involved in counterterrorism. I think when most people think of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they have this idea of the Silence of the Lambs, where they're tracking down serial killers, or they're going like in the 20s and gunning down a gangster like John Dillinger, or as shown in a number of Hollywood movies as well, busting corrupt politicians. But the truth is that after 9/11, the FBI became a lot less concerned with things like serial killers and politicians who are crooked and mobsters of any sort. The new kind of public enemy number one became terrorists, and the pursuit of terrorists has really consumed the FBI to such an extent that it has transformed entirely what was a very well-grounded organization whose mission was to investigate crimes after they occurred, to become an organization that was charged with finding terrorists before they strike. And how did that happen? After 9/11, as things like the 9/11 report well documented, the federal government was really caught flat-footed. The intelligence failed. There were signals that this attack could have happened, but none of it was listened to, and it was just such a traumatizing event. It was so traumatizing that the Bush administration, in response, told the FBI never again. And up until September 11, 2001, the FBI's focus wasn't counterterrorism. There was a counterterrorism section. FBI agents will tell you, many of whom are no longer with the Bureau, but the agents who worked at the Bureau at the time would tell you that counterterrorism was a career dead end. Like, they put their worst agents there. If you really wanted to move up, you worked in organized crime or financial fraud. All of that changed after 9/11 because George W. Bush said never again. And Congress, which sets the budget for the FBI, at the same time kind of reversed everything. And what they did was they poured billions of dollars into the counterterrorism program. And so what became a very, very small part of the FBI suddenly became its number one funding priority. Every year Congress allocates the FBI $3.4 billion just on counterterrorism efforts. And what that's resulted in has been the establishment of the largest human intelligence network ever to exist in the United States. Basically, the FBI, given this edict from George W. Bush to never again, never allow another terrorist attack to happen, went out into communities, primarily Muslim American communities, to find informants because they wanted to know who was about to set off the next attack. The belief of the FBI at the time was that there were all these sleeper cells around the country that were waiting to strike, all of which, of course, turned out to be not true. But that seed, and which was planted in the days after September 11, 2001, has since grown into what is now 15,000 informants who are employed by the FBI, primarily most of whom are working in Muslim communities. And to give you a sense of the scope of this, I think when people look at the FBI historically and they look back on the programs that were problematic or even shameful, depending on your perspective, the big one that comes to mind is the abuses under J. Edgar Hoover, the COINTEL programs where they spied on activists, they infiltrated organizations like Dr. Martin Luther King's. They were propping up in large measure the entire Communist Party in the United States because most of the members were in fact informants. And all of these things that people look back on and they say that's when the FBI really kind of went off the reservation and had all these abuses and used informants to a very destructive degree. Back then they had 1,500 informants. So today they have 15,000 informants. They have so many informants, in fact, that in 2006, the FBI had to go to Congress when it came to allocating its budget and ask for more than $1 million to create essentially a Match.com for informants. They needed a database program within the FBI so that they could figure out where the informants were and whether they could horse trade them. So as one FBI agent described it to me, he's like, if you're in Northern California and you are investigating the Somali community and you think there's a problem with a mosque that is predominantly Somali and you need someone from Somalia to go in, and you don't know any Somali informants, you can type in, Somali informant into this database and call up your friendly FBI agent who's in another district and ask them if you can borrow the informant. And that's what's happening to a large degree. And so what does this look like? An example of what can happen when informants are set out into communities to find would-be terrorists is a case outside Seattle involving two men. One was named Abu Khalid Abdul Latif, and the other was Wali Mujahid. And both were African-American converts to Islam, and both were mentally ill. Abdul Latif had a history of huffing gasoline and had several times attempted to commit suicide. And Wali Mujahid had schizoaffective disorder. He had trouble distinguishing between reality and fantasy, and had 12 different stints in psychological hospitals in the United States. So Abdul Latif is having a conversation with a man who turns out to be an FBI informant. This man is named Robert Childs, and Childs, and this, I say this for shock value, but it's not shocking for the most part. Robert Childs was a convicted rapist and child molester, and when I say it's not shocking, most of the FBI's informants are criminals. His was just a more heinous crime than most. And so Robert Childs talks to Abdul Latif in a conversation that wasn't recorded, and alleges that Abdul Latif told him that he wanted to attack a military recruiting station outside Seattle. And Robert then goes to the FBI, and the FBI puts him on the payroll to move Abdul Latif forward in a crime. Meanwhile, Abdul Latif had filed for bankruptcy. He had no money. He had no connections whatsoever to any sort of terrorist organization. Even if he knew of someone to contact overseas, he had no way of doing it. And he had no weapons and no experience using any weapons. It was actually Robert Childs, the informant, who was the one who had experience with weapons. He'd spent his teenage years in a military high school where he learned to use weapons there. And so instead of the FBI looking at these two guys and saying, these guys are kind of losers, right? Like they're not going to do anything, they're mentally ill, they spent months with Robert Childs wearing a wire where they encouraged him to move them forward in the plot. And the co-conspirator, Wali Mujahid, was actually in Los Angeles, and they needed to wire money for Wali Mujahid to come to Seattle to participate in this plot. And Abdul Latif and Childs were so ham-handed that when they were on the phone with Greyhound, if anyone's ever taken a Greyhound bus, you have to wire money and you do it under a password. So when the person who's to receive the money or the ticket goes to the Greyhound desk, they tell them what the password is. And on the undercover recordings, Abdul Latif is trying to wire the money and is asked by Greyhound what password he should use, and he mentions to Childs, he's like, well, what should we use? And Abdul Latif says, jihad, let's use jihad, right? You'd think that might get noticed at Greyhound. So, Robert Childs being the cool operator and the informant says, no, that's probably a bad idea, let's not use jihad. And so they laugh a little bit, and then he's like, let's use OBL, Osama bin Laden, right? But that was okay. So they use OBL for their password, and Wali Mujahid comes up to Seattle, and the final part of this operation is that Robert Childs provides everything that they need. They had initially decided that they were going to attack a military recruiting station, and decided that wasn't the best idea, and so they changed the attack to one of these, you've probably seen them at strip malls, where it's the incoming recruits to the military go there, and it's where the bus picks them up, and it's not guarded. If you're going to attack somewhere, it's probably a better place than a fort, which is what they were initially thinking. But again, none of these men had any weapons, yet the FBI makes that possible by taking them to a chop shop that they had seized as part of a drug operation. And they wanted to make it look believable, so they took out everything in the chop shop, and they even put a Quran on the table because Childs had said it was a good Muslim who was helping them use the chop shop for this purpose. And so Childs then goes in and he brings them assault rifles. And when Wali Mujahid takes up the assault rifle, Childs has to show him, like, this is how you turn off the automatic firing, this is how you turn it on. I mean, clearly having no experience with weapons whatsoever. And of course, as they're holding the guns, this is all being recorded by recording equipment that had been placed in the chop shop. The FBI storms in, arrests them, and prosecutes them for material support or conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, that is the guns. And they both pleaded guilty. Abdul Latif is serving 17 years in prison, and Wali Mujahid is serving 16 years. And what's really crazy about this case is that it's not unique. You know, if this was one case, you could say this is an example of a really bad case that the government pushed forward. In fact, there's nothing really unique about this at all. Since 9/11, more than 175 defendants, all Muslim, have been caught in these types of, or excuse me, mostly Muslim, have been caught in these types of undercover sting operations. You know, and by and large, the people that they're catching are not dangerous people who are connected to some kind of international network and have weapons training and have weapons of their own, or maybe even have the money and the skill to go to the local Home Depot and build a homemade bomb. That's not who they're catching. Instead, they're catching people who have been largely marginalized by society. These are people who are very poor or often mentally ill, like in the case of the Seattle sting operation. You know, for example, and at the same time, the informants that they're using are not angels. Like Robert Childs, they usually have backgrounds and criminal histories that are so much worse than the people that they ultimately target in these sting operations. These are drug dealers, rapists, as in Robert Childs' case, an accused murderer, people charged with violent crimes in other countries who then came here and were facing deportation and saved themselves by becoming FBI informants. Another example, which is quite a good one and was made into a documentary recently called The Newburgh Sting that I recommend, involved these four middle-aged poor black men outside New York in an area called Newburgh. And if you've ever been to Newburgh, Newburgh is a former Air Force town whose economy has really hit its nadir. It's a really tough place to be. And the lead defendant was a guy named James Cromedy. And James Cromedy was a Walmart stalker who didn't have two nickels to rub together. And he too had a history of mental illness. He'd been in and out of facilities, and he had gone to jail for, earlier in his life, a petty crack cocaine crime where he was selling crack cocaine, one of the industries that you can turn to in a place like Newburgh. And the FBI, for whatever reason, thought that Newburgh was a place that would be harboring terrorists. And so they send in one of their better-known informants, a man named Shahed Hussein. And Shahed Hussein was, and this is according to his story in court testimony, had fled with his family from Pakistan because he was facing murder charges, and used a human smuggler to get into the United States through Mexico. And then moved to Albany, New York, where he was running a scam that he would get immigrants to pay him money to help them get driver's licenses. And the scam was that one of his jobs was as a translator for the local DMV, so he would go in and help people take tests. Well, they don't know what he's saying when he's talking in Urdu, so he would get people to give him money and he would help them pass their test. And when it required someone who needed a driver's license and needed to do the physical driving test, he would give kickbacks, and he had a whole scam going. The FBI, you know, in no sense of irony, sends in an informant and busts him for this. So instead of facing charges and potentially going back to Pakistan where he would face murder charges potentially, he becomes an FBI informant of his own, and he worked a controversial case in Albany. And he essentially became one of the FBI's kind of super informants, one of these guys that they can send around. And so in 2008, they sent him, 2009, they sent him into Newburgh, this really poor area outside New York City. And not only did they just like send him in to look like everybody else, they sent him in like dressed to the nines. He had several different cars, he had a Mercedes-Benz, he had a Hummer. And these are the type of things that in poor Newburgh, this will get you attention. And yet, for 10 months, he was going through the city, going to several different mosques. In fact, he went to one mosque so frequently that they asked him to join the board of directors. And yet, during this whole time, he wasn't finding any would-be terrorists whatsoever. And then he stumbles on James Cromedy, who's broke and looking to find a better life, and here's a guy driving a Mercedes to the mosque every day. And they end up striking up a conversation, and James is mentally ill. He's also anti-Semitic, according to the recordings that were there, but he hadn't done anything that was violent or even illegal since he'd been in prison, and yet the informant really kind of stokes this anti-Semitism and is encouraging him to do something about it. And finally the informant tells him that he's from Jaish-e-Mohammed, the terrorist organization. And, you know, for most part, I think if anyone's kind of a wannabe terrorist, they've probably gone online and they've looked up terrorist organizations, and Jaish-e-Mohammed would probably be one that you would know about. You know, it's not exactly Al-Qaeda, but it's a pretty well-known organization. And so James Cromedy, being the FBI's target of a potential sting operation, is told by the informant that this guy is part of Jaish-e-Mohammed, and James Cromedy says, well, what is that? Like, are you guys a Muslim organization? And he had to be told, essentially, that yes, this is a terrorist group. And over the course of months, James Cromedy recruits 3 of his friends to get involved in a plot whose idea comes entirely from the informant, Shahed Hussein, who comes up with an idea of bombing synagogues in the Bronx and attacking an airport outside, airport in Newburgh with a surface-to-air missile. And he also, according to court testimony, promises these guys $250,000 and a barber shop if they'll move forward in the plot. And they do. And of course, you know, someone who needs $250,000 and a barber shop to move forward in a plot probably isn't the type of terrorist the government is generally looking for, but that's what these guys needed. And so there were real questions about whether they were doing it for any kind of ideological purpose or whether they were doing it for, like, being in a really bad part of the United States and looking to make a big payday. They were ultimately convicted at trial. James Cromedy is now serving 30 years in prison for his role in that case. And, you know, he's one of many, many cases where this has happened. And in fact, Shahed Hussein has continued to go around working for the government in cases like this. But what's significant about a case like that one, and this kind of gets at how manufactured a lot of cases against Muslim terrorism defendants can be. You know, so James Cromedy was a Walmart stalker without any guns, without any weapons, without any money whatsoever. And yet his crime ultimately consisted of bombs that they placed, or believed they were placing, in cars outside a synagogue in the Bronx, as well as a surface-to-air missile. And, you know, surface-to-air missiles are not uncommon in counterterrorism sting operations, but I'm not a weapons dealer, and I'm sure no one in this room is, but I think we can all agree that, like, surface-to-air missiles are not generally common in the United States. I mean, you know, even, like, sophisticated criminal organizations like the Mafia would really have a hard time getting a surface-to-air missile. And yet they're used in these terrorism cases to a wide degree. And it's not coincidental, and it's not because they want to make a shock and awe, to use the government's term, to the jury. It's very systematic, and what it has to do with our mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines that exist within the federal government. And so, as many of you I'm sure know, in order to get kind of the subjectivity out of sentencing in federal cases, they came up with what are termed mandatory minimum sentences. So if you're charged with one crime, there's a specific area that the judge can sentence you in, and they can't go below it. And certain things trigger the mandatory minimum sentences. And after 9/11, the mandatory minimum sentences for terrorism were revised for very much the Khalid Sheikh Mohammeds of the world in mind. And one of those mandatory minimum sentencing triggers is a surface-to-air missile. And basically that causes a mandatory minimum sentence of, I believe, 18 years, and it can go up to 35. And what you see over and over is that the government is introducing these not so much because this guy on his own ever would have had a chance to get a surface-to-air missile. It creates a situation where a defendant charged with terrorism faces going to trial where he faces you know, almost certain conviction. There's a near-perfect record of conviction in terrorism cases. Or he could plead out, avoid the mandatory minimum sentences, and get 12 to 13 years and maybe be out of prison when he's 30, 40 years old. And in the vast majority of cases, that's what we're seeing. And so these cases happen all the time, and they're really kind of clear when you see them announced. Often the government has this line that will say, you know, no one has ever been in danger. No one was ever in danger in this plot. I mean, to me, what that says is this was never a real case, right? I mean, if no one was ever in danger, this person never had access to weapons. But what I think is one of the more fascinating things that has happened, this happened after my book, you know, I'd always seen these cases and been obviously very critical of them, but I'd never really been able to get FBI agents who'd worked these cases to tell me what they really thought. I mean, I always figured that, when they're having beers or they're, behind closed doors, they're making fun of the guy because he's an idiot, right? Like the guys in the sting operations really are. And, within the Bureau, there has been a lot of debate among the agents, but for the most part, agents who are working counterterrorism tend to, stick together and defend these tactics. And where this kind of break came through for me in my research actually was a case here in Tampa involving a man named Sammy Osmakash. And I'm sure if you're casual viewers of the news, you've heard of it. And Sammy was was a Kosovo-born young man who came here after the war in the Balkans, and he too, like the defendant in Seattle, had schizoaffective disorder. At his trial, 6 psychiatrists looked at him. The 2 that were appointed by the defense said that he had schizoaffective disorder or some kind of psychosis. The 2 appointed by the judge said that he also had schizoaffective disorder or some kind of psychosis. And of course the 2 appointed by the prosecution said he was just having trouble adjusting to American society. But what happened in Sammy's case is that Sammy met a young man named Russell Dennison, and we don't fully know a lot about Russell Dennison, but Russell was a man who would post videos online and was a convert to Islam and would post these kind of crazy rambling videos about religion online. And he befriends Sammy Osmakash and takes him, for whatever reason, across town. So Sammy lived in Pinellas Park, and they decide to go not far from here to a Middle Eastern market on Bush that just so happened to be owned by an informant. And we don't know why Russell Dennison took him here. What Sammy's family suspects is that Russell Dennison was in some way working for the government. But one day they decide to drive 45 minutes just to go to a Middle Eastern market, and gets dropped off at a store that was run by an informant. Many of you may know him. It was a man named Raouf Dabous, who was active in the Muslim community in Tampa. At the time, Dabous was facing foreclosure on his home and his business, and like a lot of informants, unlike some informants, he was not a criminal, but being an informant for the FBI is about leverage, and so the leverage that the FBI had on him was that he was having financial troubles. And what we know is that the FBI paid Dabous $20,000. And we're not quite sure why the FBI was interested in Sammy Osmakash to begin with. There's some indication in the court records that he may have been subjected to some sort of FISA surveillance, but that hasn't been clear. According to Dabous, and this is a story that Sammy has denied, he goes in there and asks if he can buy Al-Qaeda flags. As ridiculous as that is, that was the government story. And Dabous goes to the FBI and says, I'm working with you, I'm an informant, and I've got this guy who wants to buy Al-Qaeda flags. And the FBI then sets up essentially a sting, just like the one in Seattle and the one in New York, and puts together an elaborate sting. But the problem that the government had with Sammy Osmakash is that, for one, he didn't have any money. Like a lot of these guys, he didn't have any money. And his car was broke. And so they needed him to get around town in order to accomplish this sting. So the way they solved that was they had Raouf Dabous give him a job at his store, and also to buy a battery for his car so that he could actually drive his car to work. So he needed the transportation to participate in this sting, and the FBI made that all possible. The second part was that when finally the FBI informant introduces Sammy Osmakash to an undercover FBI agent who's posing as someone who can provide weapons, the story that Sammy Osmakash tells him is like something that you would expect to hear from like a Batman comic book villain. They were driving around Tampa in this car wired with cameras by the FBI, and the undercover agent, who went by the name Amir Jones of all things, asks him what he wants to do. And so instead of being a reasonable terrorist and kind of trying to think of something like you could actually accomplish, like you're going to attack a mall or you're going to go into the airport with a bunch of guns, something that just seems like you could actually do it. He has this idea of bombing simultaneously all of the bridges that cross Tampa Bay, and that's what he wanted to do. And so, of course, like the FBI, if they're going to move forward in a sting like this, there's no way they could accomplish that. So what they end up doing is encouraging him to find another idea, another plot that he could actually move forward in. And the plot that he ultimately decided was to attack a nightclub in Ybor City. And so they were moving forward in this plot, and they're talking about the guns that they'll use. And then the FBI suddenly realizes, oops, that nightclub he was talking about had been closed for 3 years. And so finally they've got to kind of reassess what their plan is for this ultimate sting. And finally, Sammy Osmakash mentions McDinton's, the Irish bar in South Tampa. Sammy's brother thinks it's a result of the fact that they used to go drinking there every now and then, and it was probably the only bar in Tampa that he really knew. And then he has the idea, and we're not sure if this is the FBI or Sammy Osmakash, of then bombing McDinton's and going to the Hard Rock Casino with a suicide vest and blowing himself up when the cops arrive. So this was his plan, and he was gonna move forward with it, courtesy of the FBI. But what was so interesting about this case is that the FBI agent, the guy Amir Jones, so in all cases they will have a body wire and they'll have cameras set up in the places that they'll do the stings at. And Amir Jones was going back and talking to his FBI agent colleagues at the office, the field office over by the airport, and he was forgetting to turn his recording equipment off. And so he would go into the FBI office and meet all his friends and talk about the case that they're working on. While everyone thinks these are candid conversations and they're private, his recording equipment was on, and they ended up being transcribed as part of Sammy's trial. The judge ultimately did not allow the transcriptions in, taking for granted the FBI's argument that the release of these transcripts would reveal, this is one of the standard practices for this stuff, reveal law enforcement technique, as if this were to be exposed, then the FBI could no longer do its job. And judges in a lot of these terrorism cases tend to be more than willing to concede to prosecutors' demands, and they sealed those transcripts, and they were never used in Sammy's trial. And after his trial, we were able to get a hold of the unredacted transcripts. And what was so revealing was what they said about the FBI. The FBI field the FBI squad supervisor, a guy named Richard Worms, who was the kind of main bureaucrat running this sting operation, described Sammy as a retarded fool who doesn't have a pot to piss in. And they were talking about where his ambitions for terrorism, and they described them as wishy-washy. And when ultimately they're talking about how they're going to prosecute them, it's important to keep in mind that when these things are going on, there's usually an ongoing conversation between the FBI and the local U.S. Attorney's Office, and they make a decision about when they have enough to move forward in a prosecutable case. And Richard Worms tells the squad working this case that the U.S. Attorney's Office wants a Hollywood ending. They want something that they can sell to a jury. And to me, nothing says this case is manufactured than an acknowledgement in private that FBI agents are saying, they want a Hollywood ending. And ultimately, Sammy essentially got a Hollywood ending. They gave Sammy what he believed was a car bomb, and he picked it up at a Days Inn not far from here in North Tampa. And when he went to drive away, he was arrested and charged with conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. And so it's important to keep in mind, I think, with a case like this, if you were in Tampa when this was announced, what you saw was that first day story on the Tampa Bay Times, the Tampa Tribune, or in local television about Muslim man charged with bombing, McDinton's and plot to bomb Hard Rock Cafe. In truth, that wasn't the case at all, right? This is a guy who had no money, had no capability of committing a prosecutable act of terrorism on his own, and was mentally ill. And yet none of that comes out until far after these cases happen. And in kind of a broader term, what this has accomplished, I think, nationwide, is that these cases, by the time the truth comes out about them, the trial takes, it'll be a year or two before the trial actually comes out, and most of these cases never go to trial. And so as a result, I think most Americans, when they hear about cases like this, they really only hear the first day news story, right? And that isn't entirely the news media's fault, because in a sense, on the first day of any story, the government kind of controls the narrative. It's only the second or third day, when it's not as big of a play, when the kind of things come out. So, for example, if there was a bank robbery, that first day story on the news would be, the local police chief saying, there was a bank robbery today, this is what happened. And then only later do they maybe find out there was more to it than just a standard bank robbery. But that said, that happens in terrorism cases just like it happens in robbery cases or any other case. And that's what most Americans see. And what that has created, in my view, is that these cases kind of create the perception that the threat of terrorism from within Muslim communities and from Muslims in the United States is significantly greater than it really is. It essentially exaggerates the threat, and you could get into conversations about how it kind of stokes kind of ideas of Islamophobia in general, but in a very kind of strict sense, it does kind of create this perception that terrorism comes from within Muslim communities. Even though if you look at the data, far more people have been killed by, these gunmen like we saw most recently in Oregon or in Sandy Hook than have been killed by Muslims who have any kind of Al-Qaeda sympathies. I say that in the decade, we're now 15 years after 9/11, if you look at those numbers, you'll see a starkly different kind of body count, so to speak, from lone gunmen than from people that the FBI says are the greatest threat. At the same time, though, the government is investing billions of dollars to find these would-be terrorists, and they're the same people that they're then taking and going to Congress and talking about how we're doing such a great job. And there really is kind of this wag the dog scenario that's being created. So for example, Congress sets the budget, as I mentioned earlier, for the FBI, and every year the FBI director has to go before Congress and say, this is how we spent your money. They can't spend billions of dollars and come back and be like, yeah, we didn't really find any terrorists, right? So what happens is these terrorism cases, like Sami Yasmakash's and like the Newburgh 4, are specifically used by the FBI directors, the two most recent FBI directors, to essentially say, this is an example of us keeping you safe, this is how we thwarted terrorists, right? And so when Robert Mueller, the previous FBI director, would go before Congress and talk about what he was doing for counterterrorism, a case that he would often mention was the Newburgh 4 case, right? The case where the guy was offered $250,000 in a barbershop to move forward. But of course that's not among Robert Mueller's talking points. What his talking point is we busted 4 guys who were conspiring with Jaish-e-Mohammed to bomb synagogues in the Bronx, and they were going to move and take down airplanes with surface-to-air missiles. It sounds incredibly scary, and yet these cases, once they're closely looked at, aren't terrorism cases at all, but in fact are then being used by the FBI director without much kind of criticism from Congress about whether these were legitimate terrorism cases at all. And if you take the numbers as a whole, in the decade after 9/11, there were about 150 people like Sami Yasmakash and like the Newburgh 4 who were convicted as part of these stings. But really there were only, you can count on one hand the cases where there were real terrorists, right? There was Najibullah Zazi, who tried to bomb the subway system in New York, and there was Fajr Shahzad, who delivered a bomb to Times Square that fortunately didn't go off, and there was the guy that shot up the LL counter at LAX. There are examples of terrorists, but what's most interesting to me, I think, is that those aren't the people that are being caught in FBI sting operations. The FBI isn't catching, the really dangerous guy who has a bomb in his basement or in his garage, and were it not for the FBI sting and that informant, there would have been terrible loss of life. Instead, what they're finding are people who at best have just an idea that they want to move forward in a plot, and they are, the idea often comes from the fact that in many cases these people are mentally ill, and yet the FBI moves them forward in a plot. And so we are very good at catching kind of this low-hanging fruit, these people who are mentally ill, while at the same time the FBI has become very, very bad at catching truly dangerous threats. I mean, there's no indication that any of these sting operations would have resulted in an attack down the road, while it is clear that we are not catching, say, the Boston Marathon bombers or Fajr Shahzad or any of the truly dangerous threats. And what the FBI says in response to this, and I don't mean to bash the FBI, I want to say clearly that in my book I talk at great length about the FBI's response to this criticism, but a boiling down of that response is to say that we are getting there before someone else does. And so the FBI guiding philosophy on this is to say that, there are dangerous people out there, and maybe they're mentally ill, maybe they're not, but we're worried about the day that Al-Qaeda operative is in the United States, and he's going to be there looking for someone to help him, and a mentally ill guy who's upset at the U.S. government turns a corner, and the Al-Qaeda guy says, hey, I got a bomb, you want to move forward in this? And certainly that could happen, right? I mean, it's something I guess we could be, it's a possibility, right? It's something that may happen. But the truth is, in the 15 years since 9/11, there's never been a case where there has been an operative of a terrorist organization that has provided the means to an otherwise incapable terrorist or mentally ill person. So the FBI policy, while sounding good, and it strikes me as something that if you were, on a cable news show debate, would be something I think most Americans would be sympathetic to. Like, yeah, we've got to catch them before the real terrorists get to them. But the truth is that this never really happened. And I'll close this up shortly and then bring it over to questions. But I wanted to talk about, so for me, in framing a lot of these cases as being involved with mentally ill people, I've had criticism from former FBI agents who also say things like, well, mentally ill people can be dangerous too, and that just because they're mentally ill doesn't mean we shouldn't be prosecuted as terrorists, because terrorists are kind of crazy in their own way, and I can see that. But what I find most interesting recently has been there's been a lot of debate about gun control now that we're in kind of presidential election fever, and there was recently this shooting in Oregon, and the Republican candidates, whether they believe it or for political efficiency, can't be ones to advocate any sort of gun control. And at the same time, there is a question of like, well, what do we do about someone in Oregon, like someone who shoots people randomly, who and what you're seeing from some of the candidates, Donald Trump among them, is a description of these men as mentally ill, to say like, well, it's not the guns that are killing people, they're mentally ill, and we have to set up programs that deal with mental illness, and the irony to me in a lot of that is that these same people, that's the excuse I'm giving for the reason that these people are caught up in sting operations. And when they're Muslim and they're charged with terrorism, this idea that they're mentally ill, that's not something that's kind of tolerable in the discourse. But a white guy who shoots up a bunch of students in Oregon, that he's mentally ill, kind of becomes something that is a viable thing to talk about. And I don't think we'll ever kind of get to the point anytime soon where we can look at a guy like Sami Osmakash and have mainstream political candidates talk about mental illness the way that they have with some of the shooters. But I think it's important to recognize that really kind of some of the same factors that we're seeing among people who are committing violence exist within communities outside of Muslim communities. And what these sting operations are very much doing is focusing just on Muslim communities and finding people who are on the fringes and are vulnerable. So that is to say that the reason we're having so many terrorism prosecutions involving Muslims, and if you look at terrorism or federal court docket sheets, the vast majority of people charged with terrorism in the United States are Muslim. That would exist in a different way if they went into other communities. So for example, if they went into right-wing groups and white supremacist groups and were using these sorts of tactics, finding the crazy person who is mouthing off about wanting to commit violence but has no means, and then providing him with the means through a sting operation and prosecuting him, you would have a large number of cases that would say, look, there's a great threat among right-wing white people in the United States, and these cases show that. But we're not doing that. And the same, every community has people on the fringes who are willing to commit some sort of violence. What the counterterrorism program within the FBI has done is kind of shine this magnificent light on Muslim communities and drawn out the people who exist in every community but are vulnerable in situations like this. And that has perpetuated this idea that when you look at terrorism prosecutions in the United States, there's an overwhelming number of Muslims charged with terrorism, and that becomes this cyclical thing, to the extent that the FBI's budget recently was passed again, and just as much money for counterterrorism. So there's really no indication that any of this will stop. There is very little pushback. So far, the federal courts have been willing to side with the government on most of these cases. Entrapment hasn't worked as a defense in any of the 12 cases that have gone to trial. And at the same time, the federal government, through Congress, hasn't really been willing to provide much of a meaningful check. I mean, one check of power that the FBI has is congressional hearings, calling people, experts, to talk about these cases and questioning, like, is this really a terrorism case, and is this the best use of our money? But what's happened is we have a situation now where, congressmen are elected every 2 years. It's kind of politically dangerous to be the congressman who says, well, I don't know if terrorism is such a big deal in the United States after all, maybe we should be spending our money on something else. And so it just never gets done. And as a result, you have this kind of growing and growing problem, and an FBI that, despite a lot of public criticism, it's not just me, there are a couple of recent documentaries that have addressed this. There was a Human Rights Watch report that addressed this as well. There's a chorus of critics saying, these are problematic. And yet, FBI so far has been, unwilling to do anything and change any of these tactics. So again, I really appreciate the time here is a really good audience, so I thought if you had any questions, I'd be happy to kind of make this more of a discussion. Yes, sir.
You said there were 12 cases that have been brought to trial. How many have pled out?
Right, so 175 minus 12 roughly is the rough number. Since September 11th. Yeah, and the reason that most do not go to trial was the issue I mentioned earlier about mandatory minimum sentences, where most of these kids, they're poor, so they've got a public defender, and the public defender probably in many cases is telling them, look, you take this to trial, you go to 30 years, otherwise you go for 12. And then I think the other thing that's happened is because there have been no successful arguments of entrapment in these cases, I think it discourages even further anyone who's caught in a pretty egregious case from wanting to roll the dice and take a case like that. Yes, sir.
And why is entrapment not able to be used as a defense?
So they do use it, and it's just never been successful. Yeah. So I mean, entrapment in general is a really difficult defense because it requires, as a defendant, you to go to a jury and say, yeah, look, I did that, but I was overwhelmed by a government agent, and I never would have done it on my own. And the government is able to argue against that by being able to show what they call predisposition, which means that prior to the introduction of the government agent, they can show that you were interested in committing this type of crime. So in a more traditional crime, like let's say a bank robbery, right? If you were caught in a sting operation where you were conspiring to rob a bank, and prior to the introduction of the government agent, they've got a conversation with you talking about how, like, hey, I've been surveilling some banks and trying to find their weakness, or maybe you're online looking for information on how to rob a bank. That would be the type of stuff that they could use to argue that you were already predisposed to commit the crime. The problem for terrorism defendants in the United States right now, particularly Muslim terrorism defendants, is that the bar for predisposition is so incredibly low. And what the government has effectively been able to argue in a lot of these cases is that entrapment shouldn't apply because the person was already predisposed to commit a crime because, for example, they watched some jihadi video online. And the government has, if anyone listened to the interview I did on WMF earlier, it was about terrorism experts. And what they have is a number of experts. The most prolific is a guy named Evan Coleman, who will go on and spew a kind of junk science that basically says, this person watched these greatest hits from Al Qaeda, and abracadabra, became predisposed to commit an act of terrorism. So they're able to argue against the predisposition in that way. And then secondly, what entrapment requires is empathy from the jury to say, like, yeah, I empathize. I couldn't have done it myself, but I can see how the guy put him in that situation. And people who have studied this, like David Cole at Georgetown Law, suggest that what's happening is that any empathy that a jury might have is really kind of overwhelmed by the creation of the government. That is, like, the enormity of the plot. Like, you're going to bomb synagogues, or you're going to you've got surface-to-air missiles, and the irony is that the government supplied all of that, but seeing a guy who had that in his possession has generally been enough to hurt the building of empathy. And so as a result, no entrapment defense has been possible so far, or has been successful so far. And I think there is a reasonable debate and question asked of, like, whether a Muslim charged with terrorism in the United States today, like, whether the entrapment defense really is even a defense at this point. And I mean, so far the evidence, I think, suggests that it's not, because there have been really egregious cases. The case here involving Sami Osmakash was egregious, and then the case in Newburgh where they established testimony that the informant offered $250,000 in a barbershop. Right? That's inducement. Yeah, but even then, that wasn't enough to win entrapment. So it's a really, I think in some ways it's a very infuriating thing, because these cases are so egregious and so ridiculous, and really kind of truth being stranger than fiction in many ways, but yet that hasn't been enough to trigger, get successful entrapment defense. Yes, sir.
What about the issue of individuals who have gone to the Middle East and are American citizens, carry American passports, and then return? Is there any sort of investigations or any sort of focus in that area?
Right. So that's among the FBI's newest kind of headline concerns. What they are concerned about, and again, there's no evidence that we have specifically that this has ever happened. I mean, you could look at like Tomlin Tsarnaev and maybe draw some parallel that he went to the Caucasus and got some sort of training. But what they're terribly concerned about now with what's going on in Syria is that people will go to Syria, hook up with some really bad people, learn like how to set off explosives, learn how to build their own, and then come back to the United States under kind of the cover of their U.S. passport. And as I said, for the most part, there's no indication of a case yet where that's happened. But the FBI is taking preemptive measures with that. And one of the things you're seeing, and to me, like this has been somewhat of an abusive tactic, is that they are setting up sting operations, getting people as they're interested in flying to Syria to join. And in some cases, you can argue that there was a legitimate. The case was fairly legitimate. There's always the question of like, well, when they got to Turkey, would they have got to the border and gotten through? Would they have maybe changed their mind? The sting operation doesn't allow that. But then there have been cases that have been really problematic. Like, there was a case in New York City involving 3 young guys who said they wanted to fight with the Islamic State, and one of the guys' mother had like overheard conversations he was having about like wanting to do this, and so she actually had gone into his room and took his passport and hid it from him. And yet the FBI moved forward in the sting operation on these 3 guys where they paid for the plane tickets, they gave them everything that they needed to travel, and the guy whose passport was hidden by his mother ultimately was prosecuted for a conspiracy to go to Syria and fight with the Islamic State. Of course, like, he didn't even have his passport. And so, that has opened these kind of doors in that sense. And then there was another case where the FBI, against a Chicago kid, set up a fake website that was purporting to be like Islamic State related recruiting and communicated with him on that website. And so would he have found the way of communicating with the Islamic State were it not for that? It's unclear. But more and more you're seeing that as kind of the way the sting operations have been kind of reconfigured to the kind of the current crisis with people traveling overseas.
Is there any cooperation between NSA and the FBI? Because NSA is tapping everyone's conversations.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. So the answer is that there is some documented proof that there is some sort of cooperation, and it has to do with what's called Backdoor 702, which is under the FISA Surveillance Act and what the NSA is doing. The idea of a Backdoor 702 is that it collects all kinds of information, and that a Backdoor 702 through a warrant allows people to essentially go back in time to look at communication. So, if they weren't interested in you and, suddenly now they can go back and look at your communications from 2 years ago to see who were you communicating with people. And that is the type of information that wouldn't otherwise have been available to the FBI prior to the NSA program and FISA Backdoor 702. But that said, it's inadmissible in court. Like you can't use it as evidence, right? But what we're seeing is there's this real uncertainty, and Sammy Osmakosh's case in Tampa was one of them, where there was a Supreme Court hearing related to the NSA case, and the Solicitor General Verrilli told the Supreme Court justices there was a question of standing, and so I believe it was the ACLU was filing on behalf of what came out in the Snowden case, the Snowden document saying, we want a class action, this is affecting all Americans, and the issue at the Supreme Court became standing, which is to say, like, well, you don't have anyone who's a kind of qualified plaintiff who has been affected by this program. And the way that the government accidentally kind of defended this idea of standing was to say that terrorism defendants who are prosecuted as a result of any kind of FISA surveillance are notified of the fact that FISA surveillance was used in their case. And what was interesting about it was Verrilli thought that was the case, but it wasn't. The government wasn't notifying these people of FISA evidence, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in the government's favor on that one. So to kind of clean up the mess, what the government had to do was notify late, in many cases, that they used FISA in all of these cases, and now cases that are new, like Sammy Osmakosh's after the ruling, they are notifying as they happen, but it's unclear what this evidence is. And so, in Sammy Osmakosh's case, as an example, they basically said, yes, we have FISA evidence, but we're not going to tell you what it is because your lawyer would need security concerns. And so to me, what the interesting area of inquiry is, in Sammy Osmakosh's case, the so-called to start an investigation, the government needs what's called a predicate, where they say like, you did something bad, that gives us reason to investigate you. And so the question would be, are they using FISA and NSA-style information gathering to identify targets without a predicate, right? That would be illegal. And in law enforcement, particularly in the Drug Enforcement Administration, there's something called parallel construction, which is that if you have a reason to, like you have an informant who's off the books, and you're like, and he tells you that that car is going to be running with drugs, and you don't have a reason to pull that over, and you can't use the informant as your justification for it. You know, the standard thing would be like, oh, the busted taillight, right? And so that's the parallel construction. So the predicate wasn't like, we're not going to tell you about that informant who told us this. We're going to claim it was the busted taillight and get you for possession of cocaine. And so there's a question of like whether that's happening on a deeper level with terrorism cases. So when Sammy Osmakash says, when the government says that Sammy Osmakash goes into the store, nothing recorded, nothing memorializing this, and says, hey, do you have any Al-Qaeda flags? And he says he never said that. Then, in my view, the question is like, was that potentially parallel construction? Was this a case that the government somehow identified through information that it really shouldn't be using, and then DEA style kind of creates a predicate that is hard to argue against? And so far, I think the number is 8. There have been 8 defendants in domestic counterterrorism or terrorism cases in the United States who have received the FISA notification. The most interesting to watch is this case in Colorado involving, I'm sure I'm going to butcher his last name. I think it's Mudarov is his last name, and his lawyer has been really aggressive. Also has security clearance, so should be able to get access to it if the government or the judge will allow. And he's been pushing forward to figure out like what it is that this FISA evidence is and why it wasn't admitted as something that with evidence as part of his trial. Yes.
So what is terrorism? Why is the Oregon shooter not considered a terrorist?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, right? Like, what is terrorism? So it's become this word that is like so politically loaded that it's kind of meaningless now, right? I think a cynical view would be that if a Muslim in the United States commits terrorism, if a Muslim in the United States commits an act of violence, then it's terrorism. If a non-Muslim commits an act of violence, then it's not terrorism. I mean, certainly, like, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if the Oregon shooter was Muslim, it would have been labeled terrorism.
So there is no official definition of a terrorist?
I mean, there is, like, I mean, the government does have an official designation of it talks about like the ideological concerns, committing violence in an attempt to further some kind of political agenda with your ideology. It's very vague, and then there is a criteria of like how they charge someone with terrorism, but ultimately this is really subjective, right? And it's up to the prosecutor to charge them with terrorism. And so that really heinous like South Carolina shooting, right, where he shot the people in that church. He had this manifesto that struck me as like, that certainly qualifies as ideologically driven, right? But yet he's not charged with terrorism. And so there really is this double standard that the government has never really, explained, that it's really very rare, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, where violence committed by a non-Muslim, even with some seeming like ideological underpinning, is charged with terrorism.
I think the only one that I know of is the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, he was. Yeah, and that was such a grand scale, right?
So that's about all.
Yeah, right. Like even the
And
Unabomber was.
and that was against the federal building.
Right, yeah. No, and I think this. I mean, I wish that more people were having this conversation. And there was everyone made fun of Fox News, and they're easy to make fun of. But like there was during the Oregon shooting, the local sheriff had made his own kind of ideological statement by not releasing the name right away, and there was a lot of speculation about like what his name was. I don't even remember his name now, but it finally came out, and there was a Fox News like anchor or commentator on, and he's like, well, that doesn't sound like a Muslim name, right? And like and so the implication was that like even like to me like it was Fox News basically saying, well, if it was Muslim, then we call this a terrorism case. And you can see that of like Fox News, but the truth is that kind of attitude, if you look at like court filings and prosecutions, kind of pervades the federal government, because that is very much how they're charging Muslims who commit violence versus non-Muslims who commit some sort of violence. Yes, sir.
Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel, or we're going to be, in this kind of situation for a long time? And what do you think it will take to change this situation?
Yeah, so I don't see a light at the immediate end. I do see like very significant changes, and I think I think the Muslim community in general has become much more outspoken about this, and there's also been criticism from outside the Muslim community too. And where I see it most notably is not so much in like the government sector. I don't see any changes within the FBI or the federal government. Where I see changes is kind of how the discourse about these cases. So when these cases really started in earnest around 2005, 2006, and since then there's been a real uptick in the number of cases every year. And early on in 2005, 2006, you'd have a bust of so-called terror cell, and it was a sting operation. And the way that the media would portray it would kind of take, for granted the government's labeling of this as a terrorist, right? And then kind of make it seem as if it was as dangerous as the government would like it to be. And I think as a result of the criticism, in recent years you've seen a pullback or pushback by the media on this. And now, like when these cases are announced, for example, the New York Times and other very influential media, like very high in the story, will note the criticism of this case and note that there was no evidence of contact with terrorist organization, that it was an informant-led sting operation, and here's why these are potentially, fraught with complications and might not be all there said to be. That doesn't do any good for the people who are caught in the sting operations, but I do think that it's good that it's kind of showing that there is growing skepticism of the cases, but really the only way of kind of enacting any sort of reforms against the FBI's sting program and counterterrorism would be to get some kind of act by Congress, like a hearing that exposes a lot of, like as a journalist, I don't have subpoena power, right? And so like I do my best to put together court documents and get someone to leak me information, but congressional panels have subpoena information or subpoena powers, right? And so if you had a political will to investigate this from a congressional side, I think you'd find a lot of problems within the program. But so far, there hasn't been that kind of political courage to take this on in any meaningful way.
But when the Congress have a congressional hearing about this matter, do they ask somebody like you to educate them, somebody who was expert in,
Yeah, so they haven't.
Or just they hear one side?
No. I mean, to Congress's credit, it depends what they're doing, right? To Congress's credit, when they have looked at, so recently, as an example, Congress had a hearing on problems with the FOIA law. The FOIA law, if you request it from the government, it's Byzantine and complicated and very slow to get the records of the document. And there's a journalist named Jason Leopold who has done really fine work using FOIA almost exclusively and has become kind of the expert on this. And so when there was a congressional hearing on the problems with the FOIA law, they called him in to testify and give his perspective on that. So there is a history of when they're holding hearings, a willingness to bring people in and empower their investigators to try to find people who could provide the most illuminating testimony. But that said, they've never done any. I would happily testify to what I've reported, but Congress has so far had no interest at all in kind of investigating this. And to a certain extent, the FBI is also at times very obstinate, even the Congress. So there's a question of like what would happen if they did investigate. And the other reason I raised that as an issue is that there was the closest thing that we have to some kind of panel on anything like this is a subcommittee panel on the intelligence failures surrounding the Boston Marathon bombings. And the FBI was called to testify and just didn't show up, and nothing happened. So there's a question of like what would happen if they did call a hearing.
Wait, they didn't show up to a congressional meeting?
They didn't show up. Yeah.
Not surprised.
But they weren't going to them.
Yes, sir.
Have these cases ever sort of ended up running across to one another? Like I was just reading something the other day, Sweden was trying to limit citizens for terrorist participation in Syria until the prosecutors found out that the Swedish government was actually backing that group, and then they had to drop their case because you can't simultaneously be participating in what the government is doing and be acting illegally. So they had to drop the case there. But I was wondering with this giant network of informants, if informants have ever sort of like run into each other or something like that, where they've sort of like
Right, yeah.
got each other caught up in the net.
Yeah, so Okay, so I'll mention two things about this. So there's a really great documentary it was at Sundance earlier, and it's just getting released, called Terror, and it's got the T in the parentheses, and that deals with the kind of bumbling of two informants who run into each other. But the other thing is that there are examples of these cases like conflicting in really weird ways, and one good example of that is one of the better or more publicized cases was involving a man in Portland, Oregon named Muhammad Osman Muhammad. He was in a sting to bomb Portland's Pioneer Square. Every year they have this enormous Christmas tree lighting ceremony, and a government informant had, two undercover agents had led him in a sting. And because it was, these cases, there's a lot of them, but some get more attention than others, I think because of the circumstances. And this was one of those cases that made the national news, and a lot of people were talking about. And so he gets busted trying to bomb Pioneer Square, makes the national news. At the same time, there is this case in Baltimore involving this convert named Antonio Martinez. Antonio Martinez was just pathetic. He had just recently accepted Islam, and for whatever reason was typing some really crazy things on Facebook, and that's how he came to the FBI's attention. And he gets involved in a plot with an informant to bomb a military recruiting station. And there was it was one of these comical cases where the FBI needed him to deliver the car bomb to the military recruiting station, but the problem was that he didn't know how to drive. And so the FBI undercover agent is in a parking lot with him, teaching him how to drive. And so anyway, but that case, so they're halfway through this case after they've taught him to drive, and he's at home watching the national news and sees this Muhammad Osman Muhammad case announced, and they're talking about the circumstances of the sting, and suddenly he's like, this sounds an awful lot like what's going on with me, right? And so he calls up the informant, and he's like, I want to know what the hell's going on. There's this case this case going on in Portland, and it sounds a lot like what's going on with us. And the informant tells him no, calm down, just come over, let's talk about it. And what's interesting is that there's also there's a lot of what are called recorder malfunctions that happen in these cases, and so Antonio Martinez goes over to see the informant, and we don't know what was said because there was an apparent recorder malfunction, and all we know is that then Antonio Martinez goes along with the plot and gets arrested and serving 17 years, right? But to me that was the kind of the ironic intersection of two cases where he figured it out, right? And then yet kind of got drawn back into it as a result. Anything else? Anyone else?
Just to mention that movie you're talking about, Terror, our executive director appears in that movie because the sting guy had gone to him for legal advice because he knew he was being stalked by the FBI.
Right, yeah. No, it's a really great. Actually, the informant I mentioned earlier, Shahed Hussein, who was the one who fled Pakistan on murder charges and offers $250,000 in the barbershop. He's one of the informants in this documentary that kind of bumbles, and it's really, what's great about the documentary is it's one thing to hear someone like me talk about the absurdity of these cases, and I try to illustrate it as best I can, but it's totally something else to be able to see it firsthand, and what the filmmakers were able to do is they had this one informant cooperated with them, and they are with him for the entire sting, and they would have the FBI conversations with the informant when he's talking on the phone, and the informant admitting that what he's doing is just ridiculous, and it's really great, really worth watching, and I think really scary because it's not just one case. It's an example of what happens in city after city in all these cases.
The other odd thing that I've seen trials that I have gone to is in Sammy's trial, one of the main witnesses testified under a pseudonym, and even the defense lawyer didn't know who he really was.
Yeah.
I think that's common, isn't it?
Yeah, what will happen more often in the sting cases is that the FBI informant or the undercover agent, the government will be able to convince the judge that the person is in danger because the real terrorists out there might kill them if they're exposed, right? But the irony is that in these sting operations, there really aren't any real terrorists involved, right? So who is it that's going to necessarily hurt them?
How does a defense lawyer deal with that?
Right. And also the perception, I think it creates for the jury, right? You're weighing this man's guilt or innocence, and most people inherently trust the government, and the government is saying this guy is so dangerous that we can't show the identity of this witness. I think it does prejudice the jury to some extent. Yes, sir.
You mentioned there's about 15,000 paid informants approximately.
Right.
Do you know approximately, this would totally be an estimate, but do you have any idea approximately how many mosques or masjids there are in the United States? More or less than 15,000?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would guess more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is like, I know there's a database of mosques online, but I don't know how accurate that is or what the count is on that. And you know, the other thing to keep in mind is like, I don't think the FBI ever at any time has had a goal to like get an informant in every mosque per se, but the goal has been like, so what the FBI tries to do, and this goes back to the mafia days, with the perception of informants is like, there's a power even when they're not there. So the idea is that like back in the mafia days, they wanted all of these organized crime outfits to always be wondering like, is that person an informant, and you know, can I trust him? And in the FBI's view, what this does is creates a disruptive environment for crime, right? And so with informants, especially in Muslim communities, it's not so much is there one in every mosque, but it's the FBI's attempt to create a disruptive environment, so to speak, to say like, we want everyone to think that there's an informant in every mosque, you know? And so, you know, and it's not unusual to hear people kind of joke, right? Like every time I pray on Friday, I just assume the guy next to me is an informant, right? And like that's, you know, to a certain extent, I think that's kind of a goal accomplished for the FBI, that even though they have this enormous human intelligence network, there's no way that they could fully scale it out to cover everything. So, you know, if they can't do that, then they create the perception that they have.
Could you talk, I remember in your book, I remember you mentioning more about the recording malfunctions. You mentioned it briefly. Could you talk a little more about one of the egregious examples of the recording malfunctions and very important, what you think are very important times?
Yeah, I mean, right. So, I mean, I find the recording malfunctions to be like really hard to believe, especially because they happen so frequently.
Yeah.
And the FBI.
You mentioned you like had one in your whole career.
Right. So then, yeah, and I'm using like a Best Buy $40 recorder, right? Like the FBI has some really nice stuff. And you know, no. So it is pretty amazing. Like, you know, one of the in the Newberg case that I've been talking about throughout the evening, before they commit this purported act of terrorism, they all go to a TGI Fridays of all places, and it's to be like the Last Supper, and they're all going to talk about like what they're going to do. And so this would be like a critical moment to be recorded, and they had a recorder malfunction then, right? So there's all kinds of questions of like, was he like saying to them like, you know, I know you don't want to do this, but come on, there's $250,000, right? Like all of these things that he could have been saying given the evidence, you know, we don't really know. And then, but kind of more troubling is like most often the recorder malfunctions tend to happen at the very beginning of a sting, when they're just getting to know someone, and what defense lawyers talk about is that is the most critical time to prove entrapment, because early on they might be like, yeah, I'm really upset about U.S. foreign policy, but I'm not into violence, man, you know, and then, you know, they don't get that recorded, but then like later on, once they've been primed a little bit, then the recording starts, and but no, it's really amazing, and to me, like if there ever were congressional hearings on that, I mean, I would like to know why it is that like so many cases have recorder malfunctions with this. I mean, we can wiretap like every phone call, but you know, we can't figure out the recording devices. So.
Would you all give Trevor a hand, please?